Good morning. This is the Oakmont Sunday Symposium, virtual style. And we are delighted today to have Dr. Sarah Gebber with us. Kathy will be introducing Dr. Gebber momentarily. In the interim, a couple of housekeeping issues. First, we will have a hopefully robust Q&A session when Sarah's done with her talk. And the best way to get your question on is to type it into the chat. And if you happen to know how to raise your hand, we'll recognize raised hands. But in the alternative, the best alternative is to use the chat. And I will remind you now, but remind you again at the end, that our next lecture next Sunday is on beavers and is intended to be a celebration of Valentine's Day, beavers being animals that are known to mate for life. So with that in mind, Kathy, would you introduce Dr. Gebber?
Well, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Sarah Gebber, who's with us today. She's a nationally known and highly sought after speaker at conferences on aging. PBS has designated her one of 2018 influencers in aging. Her book, Essential Retirement Planning for Solo Agers, a retirement and aging roadmap for single and childless adults, was selected as best book on aging well by the Wall Street Journal. With her speaking and writing, Sarah has been raising awareness of solo agers for the past 10 years. She believes solo agers have unique needs in later life that warrant greater foresight and a more robust approach to planning. She's a regular contributor to Forbes.com on topics of aging and retirement. As a solo ager herself, Sarah lives with her husband in Santa Rosa, and we are honored to have her today.
Thank you, Kathy. Oh, I am so glad to be here. It's not often that I get to do a talk for people that I know are right down the road from me. I live in Northeast Santa Rosa, kind of just off Calistoga Road. So you're all my neighbors, and a few of you on the call I know personally. So without further ado, I want to show my slides, but I also want to mention that I would very much welcome any questions or comments that you have in the chat. And there'll be a couple times during my presentation that I'll actually be asking you to put some things in the chat. So be ready to do that if you're so inclined. We're not going to hold your hand to the fire if you don't feel like it. But I do like to do this in as casual a way as possible, given that we're not actually together physically. That gets a little challenging. But using the chat makes it a little more casual. And of course, what I'd like to do is finish in plenty of time to give you all a chance to ask questions that I suspect you'll have, or to make some comments. I'd always welcome people to share their own experiences, share their own plans that they've made or reasons why they aren't planning. You'll see as we go through this that I'm a big fan of planning. And I'd also like to say, which I mentioned to the few people that were on in the very beginning of this, as we were kind of testing out our sound and everything, that I know that those of you who have moved to Oakmont have made the first very, very positive step in planning for later life, because we just don't have a crystal ball and we don't know what's going to happen. But you've all at this point moved into a tight community where companionship and people to do things with, even if it's just a masked walk around the neighborhood, are right out your front door. And not everybody can say that. So I applaud you all for having taken that step. So without further ado, let me start my slides. Bear with me here a moment. Okay, everybody seeing my slide and not my notes? Okay, good. So Let me start by defining solo aging for you, because I think just on the face of things, solo aging can sound like a lot of different things. So let me do that by getting into a little of my background and sharing with you how I came up with the idea of solo aging and started to really look at what some of us are facing. I would say about 10 to 12 years ago, I started noticing that a lot of my friends and coworkers and contemporaries of all sorts, some of my clients, were beginning to spend a lot of time taking care of their aging parents. At that point, we were all in our late 50s and somewhere around middle 60s, and our parents, if they were still alive, had moved into their 80s and 90s, and in many cases needed help. So I had friends that were flying back and forth across the country. I had friends that actually a couple friends that had to take a leave of absence from their jobs to make sure that their elder parents were well taken care of, had food, and were taking their medicine as required, and all of the different things that people end up helping their parents with. And I would bet that a lot of you on this call spent some time taking care of your own parents. And some of you may still have living parents that are in their 90s and even early 100s. I have a cousin of my husband who just turned 97, and she was living in a Brookdale facility right here in Santa Rosa, and her daughter just recently moved her into a board and care home. So I'm kind of taking a lesson from that too, because we're very close to them. But at any rate, we started seeing a lot of this, and I was having a glass of wine with a friend of mine who also does not have children. Like George mentioned, my husband and I don't have children. We're solo agers. And I said to my friend Sandy, I said, who's going to do that for us? And we looked at each other and took another big gulp of wine and said, well, doesn't look like there's anybody around that's going to do that for us. So at that point, I realized that my husband and I needed to do some pretty robust planning to make sure that we were going to be safe and secure into our later life. And I started to do some research, and I found that there was just nothing, absolutely nothing written about solo agers, as I started to call them. So I began to talk to a lot of my colleagues about it. At that time, I had moved from my organizational consulting work to doing retirement coaching. And I started talking to some of my clients, and I talked to some of the associations that I had begun to join, like the American Society on Aging, and nobody had even thought about it. There wasn't any literature, there was just no research. So I started it. And the more I talked about it, the more people got interested. And a few years went by, and pretty soon it turned into a book. So now I'm happy to say that there are many other people out there using the term solo aging and solo ager. And the one thing that did happen is that after I created my definition of solo ager, people started to really push back. When I would give talks about it, people would raise their hands in the talk, or they'd come up to me afterwards and say, well, wait a minute. You don't have to just not have kids to be a solo ager. I'm a solo ager. My single child lives in Denmark, or I've been estranged from my kids for years, or my kids are just barely functional. So I began to realize that there are more solo agers out there than just those of us that don't have kids. But as you'll see in a minute, even those of us who don't have kids are pretty numerous. And why is this not changing? Okay, there we go. So I think it's interesting to look at the statistics. This graph shows you the share of women who did not bear children. And as you'll see, the line starts steadily climbing from the late 70s up to when we took the measure was at 2008. Now, this is done by the Pew Research Center, which is a very, very well-respected research organization, and they get their data from the census. So what they discovered is that by 2008, at which time baby boomers were pretty much at the end of their childbearing years, by 2008, 19.4% of women had not born children. Now think about that a minute. That's almost 1 in 5 women in the baby boom generation who didn't bear kids. Now, some of them inherited kids by marrying someone who already had them, and some women adopted children. So that's not the end all and be all. But as you can imagine, it's very telling. So, why are there so many of us? Well, think about what was happening back in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. It's not hard to figure out. And when I'm in person with people, I let the audience answer this question, and you've probably figured it out already yourself. We had, number one, we had the pill. Women could finally control their reproductive processes if they wanted to. Secondly, there was a lot of push toward equal rights for women, which meant that the doors to prestigious universities and to professions that women had never been very welcome in before, if they were allowed at all, started to tumble down, all of those barricades. So women in the baby boom generation, starting from the very beginning of leading edge baby boomers like me, had the option of having kids or could have a career. Didn't even have to get married. We could support ourselves at that point. So huge changes came from that. And as you can see, the graph just kept going up. Now, what's going to happen in successive generations? We don't know. Gen X came along and they're having a few more kids. Their rate is down to about 15%, I think. But the younger people today are really having to think twice about whether they can afford to have kids, want to have kids. But at any rate, this probably is going to be an issue that isn't going to go away with our generation either. So I have my first question to ask you at this point. And this is switching tracks just a little bit, but assuming that many of you on the call, I'm sure not all, but many of you on the call are solo agers, and anybody can answer the question. Think about what brings you happiness at this point in your life. And if you have some thoughts on that, just enter them into the chat because I'd like to see what your ideas are. What brings you happiness? Yeah, let's see if I can get my chat to show up. Yeah. George, what do we have in the chat? Do we have anything in there?
The first posting is varied activities.
Yeah, good.
Okay, the second posting is my pets and my close friends.
Ah, great.
The third
thank you.
is a cup of coffee with a friend.
I just got my chat to show up, but thank you for that, George. So we have a cup of coffee, we have enjoying nature, we have doing activities with friends, family, friends, nature, dancing, friends, family, travel. All very, very typical answers to what brings us joy and happiness at this point in life. Now, the reason I ask you this is because I like to make a point about what it is that does bring us happiness at this point. So if you look at this next slide, it's another graph. And the reason I show it is because I like to focus on those top 2 lines. This was a study that was done about 15 years ago with people who were 60 and above. And it asked them to choose among these things which ones they valued most in terms of their own source of happiness. And as you can see, relationship with family and friends and friendship are almost neck and neck. And the reason I think this is important is because you don't have to have family to have a meaningful, connected life. And I think that is so important for solo agers. And one of the chief reasons why I think it's so excellent that those of you out there who are solo agers have made the move to Oakmont, because you have assured yourself of living in a community that has all of these opportunities that you've listed in the chat really kind of at your fingertips. So it's an excellent step. It may be a first step for some of you. It may be the only step for some of you. And of course, again, we don't know yet. So you can see the rest of these activities kind of trail, or the rest of the sources of happiness kind of trailed off. But it's those relationships, just as you have put in the chat, it not only with friends and family, but even pets, that have been so important. And it's pretty easy to answer that question after almost a year of being secluded in our own homes for the most part. So what was 2 years ago a tougher question for some people to kind of wrap their minds around, now it's at the front of all of our minds. What are some of the things that we have in our lives that really bring us happiness? So I'm going to show you now a kind of an image of how that connectedness works out for people that are solo agers versus people who have more of a family around them. And I like to call this a social network. Now, as you'll notice, this is a typical social network of someone who does have children and grandchildren. And you can see how it grows organically. You're certainly connected to your children, and as they grow up, they have friends, and you probably become friends with some of their friends' parents, or even the friends themselves. And once they have grandchildren, you become friendly with all that opens up to, and more in-laws. So I've watched this in so many of my friends who do have children, that their world has just expanded astronomically, especially if their kids live locally. Now, if your kids don't live locally, it's a little harder, and this gets a little thinner. But for people whose families do stay local, or at least in the Bay Area, this often happens. On the other hand, people who are solo agers don't have the opportunity for that kind of network. But what we do develop is a special kind of network that may be based on our friends in the community. It may kind of revolve around our kin, our relatives, meaning our siblings, and maybe nieces and nephews. I have one friend who came from a family of 5 women. I knew them when we were all girls, and 4 out of the 5 of them went on to marry and have careers and have children. And they all kind of stayed around the Northern California area, mostly around the Bay Area. But my one friend that I was closest to did not marry or have kids. She's a scientist, and she spent a lot of her early years down in the Galapagos. Well, she is one solo ager that I don't even worry about, because she's so close to her nieces and nephews that I know when it's, as she has been making her plans for and naming people on her advance directives and whatnot, she's been talking to her nieces and at least one nephew about being there for her and explaining to them what that's all about. So she is a solo ager who's very well connected. I unfortunately don't have that option. Neither does my husband. We don't have nieces and nephews that live nearby. So we're going to be depending more on some other connections that we have. And I suspect some of you are in that camp as well. And some of you may be more in the camp of my friend Linda. So that's what the social network of a typical solo ager kind of looks like, and the connections that we depend upon. And social support systems are so critical to a happy and successful retirement and aging. Once again, the fact that you're in Oakmont, and I know how close that some of your communities, kind of communities within the Oakmont communities, can be. Um, it's a wonderful boost to having the kind of social support networks that are really supportive of you as you grow older. So, there's so many ways that we all must look at to avoid isolation. And boy, have we ever seen what isolation and loneliness can do to people during this time of COVID. So, as we can now, and when we can again, so many of these ways of staying connected are very, very important. And a lot of these are, once again, available to all of you in Oakmont now. We are among the people of the multitude of people that adopted a dog right at the outset of COVID. We were very lucky to have found a great dog at a rescue back in March. But I know many of you have dogs, and I think that some of the ways that we've all stayed sane is through our pets. So it's one way that we avoid isolation among all of these others, and probably many more as well. So looking at our kind of the potential support system that everybody has. If you look at these little intertwined circles or bubbles, this could represent anybody's social network. We all have some people in all of these bubbles. Now, the first bubble to disappear on us is likely to be those colleagues and acquaintances that maybe we knew at work. Because once you retire from your midlife career and take up something else to feed your soul and take your time, that bubble can disappear. Occasionally, we can salvage some relationships out of those days of work, but usually that doesn't happen so easily. The next bubbles kind of disappear one at a time at random, or you're going to see them disappear, but sometimes they just shrink and they don't totally disappear, but we never know. I just took the friends off of there. Probably a number of you have experienced what I've experienced, and that is friends moving away because they want to go live near their kids, or especially their grandkids once they have them. I know I have seen several friends that I just assumed were going to be near me for life move across the country because they wanted to follow their kids to wherever that job took them in Austin, Texas, or Enid, Oklahoma, or wherever it might be. So people move, and people leave your life for a variety of reasons. I know that you, like I, have also lost friends because they've passed on. So people just do disappear from our sphere for a variety of reasons, and sometimes the spouse disappears as well. Now, if we let those bubbles shrink to nothing, then what are we left with? Not a real pretty picture. You don't want the only relationships in your life that remain to be the people that you pay to take care of you, the doctors and all of the other support services that you might need. At least to me, that's not a great way to spend my final days. I'd rather it look more like this, that I have my friends and community close to me, and it's a robust system, and it's big because I don't know who's going to leave that community at what point. Again, we just don't have that crystal ball that we all wish we had. So, thinking about your own social network, I'd like you to take just a minute, and I'm actually going to just leave it silent for about a minute, and think about who is part of your social network and how sticky are they? In other words, how much can you depend on them hanging around for all kinds of reasons? Have they talked about moving? Do they have kids in a different state? How healthy are they? So again, I'm just going to be quiet for a minute. And if you have something to write on, you might want to actually take some notes on this. Okay, that was a minute. And now I would love to see some of your thoughts in the chat. What came up for you as you were thinking about your social network and kind of who is around you, who you consider your support system? Is there anyone who wants to add your thoughts into the chat? Not seeing anything yet, but that's okay. As things come to you, just feel free to add them and we'll work with them in a little bit. Let me go on then, and I'd like to share with you what I've discovered from my own research, what solo agers need to think about for the future. And the way I did this is to really observe what it is that adult children do for their aging parents. And these are the key things that adult kids get involved in. And they may get involved with them in different ways. When you have kids that live locally, they often get involved with parents who eventually find that that bill paying becomes a huge chore. They can be very involved in real estate transactions. When it's time to sell a home, when it's time to move into a place where you can get more care, it's often the adult children that handle those transactions. Again, without that crystal ball, we don't know whether we're going to lose cognitive ability as we get older or not. And I think we all have to face the reality that that could happen. And the longer we live, the greater the possibility of that. It's just the reality. So the things that adult children help with can really be all over the map. And sometimes those adult kids help by moving their older parents into a place where they can get more care. And sometimes they help by coming to live with them and doing it for them. But these are all the kinds of things that solo agers need to think about because we may need help with in the future. So I'm not going to belabor this one too much because you have all made the first major step in deciding where you're going to live. But not all of you are going to choose to live in your Oakmont community forever. And some of you are probably already thinking about what might my next step be. Now, these are all the conventional models. I suspect everybody in this call knows what they are. One of the things that I have found very disconcerting over this last year, as we've seen nursing homes get completely raked over the coals, and in good case, or for good reason in a lot of cases. But unfortunately, most of the public has no idea that a nursing home differs from an assisted living community. No idea. They think that any place where older adults go to live must be a nursing home. And if they've only visited a nursing home one time in their life when they were 12 years old to visit Aunt Betty, then that's all they know. So one of the things that many of my colleagues and I try to do as much as possible is to educate people about these different kinds of senior living opportunities. So you all live in what I consider the kind of first step in that, a 55 plus community where almost all of your homes, I believe, are on one level and they're smaller and you have neighbors closer to you. But of course, beyond that, there are other independent senior living and continuing care retirement opportunities where you can also have your meals and some cleaning, and a lot more is kind of built into that. And the ones I've listed here, of course, the ones you're probably familiar with, they're all in our local area. And then beyond the continuing care communities, there's which offer at whatever level of care you need at the point you need it, are the assisted living communities that from the get-go offer aid with some of the activities of daily living. And those, you have Oakmont Gardens, of course, right in your backyard, and then Brookdale and Sunrise Villa and some of the others. And then there are board and care homes. I mentioned that my husband's much older cousin, who just turned 97, was moved from an assisted living community to a board and care home because she needed more almost 24/7 watching. She really can't do much for herself at all anymore, unfortunately. And her hearing is almost non-existent, and her vision is greatly deteriorated. So on the other hand, I have a 98-year-old friend who lives in Berkeley, where I grew up, and he is still living in his multi-story home, and his kids come by and bring some meals, and he has friends that stop by, and he's pretty amazing. No cognitive decline, still has his full hearing and his vision. So he's still reading books. So people age at different rates, and we just don't know what's in the future for us. So it's simply important to take all of these things into consideration and know that they're out there. There are, of course, some new living models that have entered the scene, some in the last 20 years, some only in the last 5 years. I am a big fan of all of these things. Co-housing is something that some of you may have heard of because you have a friend that lives in one of our local co-housing communities. These people have their own home, much like you do now, only they're much smaller. And the people that live there completely own the land and run the community. So it's kind of like living in a condominium where your homeowners association is the how you connect with all the rest of the residents. Usually those residents are no more than 30 or 35. And they have meals together 2 or 3 times a week, and they have movie nights and all kinds of things. So it's what's known as an intentional community. There's a couple in Sebastopol, there's one in Katati, there's probably the one you're most familiar with or have driven by a million times. Is the one on Yulupa Commons. It's almost across the street from Whole Foods, that multicolored building. That's a co-housing community. The village concept hasn't really taken off in Sonoma County, with the exception, I believe, of Petaluma. It's neighbors being able to work together with other neighbors and vet services and whatnot. If you're curious about any of these things, they're very easily accessible on the internet. And home sharing is one of the newer ones that's come along. And the best way to describe this is to say, it's a la Golden Girls. What you saw in the Golden Girls shows of the 80s is exactly what home sharing is about. Sharing your home with a like-minded person or even a younger person. A lot of good opportunities for people who want to get some of the rougher stuff done around the house, cleaning the gutters and pruning the trees and things, and let a younger person who's trying to get their feet on the ground in their career share the house with them so they can do more of the heavy lifting and get a break on the rent. So it can be in either direction. A lot of people choose to live with a contemporary. And these are for people who either need a place to live or people who have a home and would like to share it. And there are now opportunities to find home mates on the internet in a lot of different areas. And some of the links that I listed here, especially Silver Nest, is probably the key one going in the United States right now. And a NORC, I'm going to explain briefly, is just a naturally occurring retirement community. You see a lot of these in New York and other big cities where people live their whole lives in these high-rise buildings. And sometimes they age all kind of at the same rate, and pretty soon they form their own retirement community. And I've seen instances where they have um, gone in together to pay for aid, a certain number of hours a day, or transportation. They have become their own retirement community and reaching out for their own services together. So it can take a lot of different forms. One of my favorite forms of a NORC is mobile home parks. And as you've no doubt noticed, we have several beautiful ones in Santa Rosa. And a lot of times, those retirement communities, some are actually 55 plus communities. And in fact, my mother lived in one down in Southern California in the California desert. Huge mobile home community with lots of activities. People all knew one another. They all went to the same place to get their mail and do their wash and whatnot. So that can be a wonderful example of a NORC. So those are the different kinds of ways that people can form community and can live in different ways. So once again, I want to present this slide and ask you the question: how ready do you think you are? Especially if you are a solo ager, how ready are you for solo aging? Because there are so many things that we can do to get ourselves ready for it. And of course, I like to think of solo aging as kind of one of those three-legged stools where we've got the financial on one leg, we've got the legal on the other, and we've got the social on the third. Now, I really think the social is probably the most important, but the financial and the legal are important too. And the one option that we have here in California, and I think solo agers are starting to make really good use of this, is we have such a thing as a licensed professional fiduciary. And for those of you that have been or are a member of the forum, one of the presentations that I helped organize a couple years ago for a forum morning was a presentation by a professional fiduciary. And most people at the meeting had never heard of it. And one person at one point raised their hand and say, well, do you take the place of a lawyer? And the answer to that is no. A professional fiduciary takes the place of your kids. That professional fiduciary can be the person who, when the time comes, if the time comes that it's necessary for someone to make decisions on your behalf, a professional fiduciary can do that, both in the financial arena, because as their name suggests, that is mainly what they do, but also they can be named on as a healthcare proxy. So just something to think about, and for some of you, maybe something to look into. I know that my husband and I will be going that route. We're starting to interview professional fiduciaries, and we'll pick one that we feel good about, we kind of resonate with. In the same way you'd pick a doctor or a dentist, you want someone that you feel good about. Most fiduciaries, interestingly enough, come from a background of people. They have been social workers, or they may have been nurses. They're real people-oriented individuals. So to my surprise, I thought they would be a bunch of burnt out accountants or lawyers that decided they didn't want to practice law, but that's not the case at all. Most of them are very people-oriented. I've been to a few of their PFAC meetings, Professional Fiduciary Association meetings, and there's a very active chapter here in Sonoma County. They meet in Santa Rosa, before COVID anyway, once a month. And I haven't been to any of their online meetings, but it's a good way to get to know some of them and know what they do. So it's something to check out. There are websites where you can check out professional fiduciaries and get in touch with one. Seems like a good idea to me to find someone who's maybe in their 40s or 50s, and they've been a fiduciary for somewhere around 10 years, and and have every intention of continuing, and that they may work for a small firm of fiduciaries so that if anything happens to them, there's someone there backing them up. To me, it's the opportunity to get to know someone over the years, and maybe pay for an hour of their time once, I don't know, once or twice a year, is money well spent, because where they really make their money, of course, is on the back end when they start doing things for you and billing the estate. So anyway, that actually brings me to the end of my presentation today. This is my book. It can be ordered. It covers a lot more than we covered here today, but it can be ordered from any online bookseller, but also Copperfields can get it for you if you prefer to give them the business. So, and now I want to open it up to questions. And I see we have one question is, oops. All right, thank you, George. Is fiduciary an individual or a company with many members? What if you outlive your fiduciary? I think I ended up answering that. A fiduciary can be a solo individual in a kind of a solo practice, or they may be with a small firm of fiduciaries. By the way, one way of finding a fiduciary is that most lawyers have a kind of a, here's an old term for you, a Rolodex of fiduciaries that they call upon when they want to connect someone with a fiduciary. So whatever attorney did your estate planning, hopefully you've done that, will probably know some fiduciaries. But again, there are quite a number of them here in Sonoma County that you can meet with and check out. They typically charge way less than an attorney. Their time bills out at generally somewhere 125, 150 an hour. So nothing that's going to break the bank once a year. And of course, you have to have some kind of level, I don't know what level, but you have to have some kind of an estate where they can assume they'll be billing when they do have to take over decision making or help you get moved to an assisted living community, or help hire someone to come in and give you aid in your home. Those are the kinds of things that they can do. Handle paying your bills, that kind of thing. Okay, let's see. I recently met with my COVID bubble of Oakmont friends to talk about end-of-life planning. We agreed to share contact info for our emergency contacts, name and phone number of our physicians, et cetera, location, spare key to our homes, passwords, et cetera. It was an excellent conversation. I highly recommend doing this with close friends. My hat's off to you. Lynn, I think is it Lynn or Linny McAleer, for posting that. I think that's fabulous. A number of people I know have formed circles like this. We have, it's excellent. The problem, of course, comes in where we're all contemporaries. We're all going to age at the same time, and we don't know, as I'm sure your group doesn't know who's going to outlive whom and who's going to outfunction whom. So I always encourage people to try and bring in some younger people into these circles. One way of doing that is through the other groups you belong to. I have purposely sought younger people since I've lived in Santa Rosa. And by the way, I've only been here for about 5.5 years. I've joined a couple of book clubs, and one of them is one that has a variety of ages from, I'd say, mid-40s on up to 70s. So I've gotten to know some younger women that way, and my intent is that within the next couple of years, I'm going to choose one or two of them and say, would you entertain the idea of being on my care plan at one level or another? So I may have a contemporary as kind of my first line of defense. Well, my husband's my first line of defense, and then comes someone that's probably near my age, and then I want to list someone younger. So that's a challenge for a lot of people because for whatever reason, if we don't have kids, we tend not to hang out with younger people. Our friends tend to be people of around our age. And
Dr.
yes,
Yeah, Dr. Gebber, let me make a quick comment, then I'm going
sure.
to swing over to Juanita, who had her hand up.
Okay.
Uh, Oakmont is interesting in that about half of the people in Oakmont are over 75 and about half are under 75.
Hmm.
And the influx of people who have come in has been predominantly the younger baby boomers, not the older baby boomers. So what we have
Interesting.
a mix that goes up well into the 90s, and I would not be surprised if we have at least one person here who's over 100. Uh, there's an interesting mix within Oakmont
Hmm.
of people spreading over a wide range.
That's
Juanita, you had a question.
true.
Yes, I was personally thinking of solo aging a little differently, which is more like my own situation where I have children who could take care of some of the major physical things and financial things, but they're not there for the day to day. And no matter where I live, they'll never be there because they have their own lives. So it's the social challenge that I, try to work out what next. If I would have to leave Oakmont, how would I maintain that social challenge? Or can I figure out a way to stay here and get the other things I need? So I wanted your comments on that particular challenge.
Well, everyone has their own kind of unique situation. When I'm talking to people who do have kids, I say, you don't want your kids to have to rush in from their jobs and have to help you. You want to plan these things ahead as much as possible. Because nobody wants to burden their kids with their own care as they get older. I hear that over and over and over again. I can remember hearing it from my own parents. But if you don't plan for something like that ahead of time, then your kids may end up picking up whatever pieces are left. Let's say you have a stroke or something. However, if you do have a plan that, let's say you've looked around and you said, if I need to go to an assisted living community, this is the one I want to go to. If you've done that ahead of time, your kids or even your friends here will know how to help you do that. If you don't have a clue ahead of time what's going to be the next step for you, then it'll be harder. I also, now again, I'm speaking to an unusual group here at Oakmont, but I always encourage people who can move into continuing care communities early. The earlier, the better, depending on your finances, because those are expensive places. But with regard to your social connections, a lot of people, of course, want to do what's the popular term aging in place and stay where they are and bring care into them. So in that case, what you might want to familiarize yourself with is some of the certified senior care advisors in this area that you can, kind of like the fiduciary, you can talk to ahead of time and say, I want to put you in my healthcare directive so that you can come in and direct my care if I should need it. If I can't speak for myself, I need someone to do that. And I don't want my kid rushing in from Arkansas where they have a law practice or whatever it might be. Does that make sense, Juanita?
It's a little different than what I was thinking about because what I am discovering about myself, even and particularly right now, is I'm alone all the time, except for my dog. My son said, well, if he starts telling you to do things, call me and ask me whether it's right or not. So it's, arranging to get things taken care of, or even myself taken care of. But if you have someone come in to take care of you, you're still alone most of the time.
Right. And
that's the part that I'm for myself trying to work out is what is the plan once I can't drive?
Yeah. And
Or
you're, Juanita, you're very, very smart to think about that. And again, I like senior living communities. I'm a big fan
they're
of them.
expensive.
What
They're very expensive.
they are, that actually bringing in care is about on a par with many senior living
Yeah, I
assisted
don't think
living
bringing
communities.
in care, for me, bringing in care isn't a good idea because it keeps you isolated.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Not
Together.
everybody does, but I do agree with you.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So yeah, almost full-time or almost full-time help from an aide turns out to be about the same price as moving into a assisted living community.
Mhm.
So now, one of the things, uh-oh, I didn't bring myself any water. One of the things I also like to mention is that there is life beyond California. And if finances are the biggest stumbling block, assisted living communities and continuing care communities are a lot less expensive elsewhere. So just want to say that. Just, I know, I'm a Californian too, born and raised. Other questions? Let's see. What are the pitfalls of planning to age in place? Well, I think Juanita and I have just been highlighting the pitfalls of aging in place. It's isolation and loneliness. Some of you might find it interesting to look at one of my early January posts. I have a page that I post to a couple times a month on Forbes.com. And the title of the post that I made in early January was Aging in Place, a Great Way to Extort Payback from Your Adult Children. So so that pretty much sums up my opinion of aging in place.
Dr. Geber, if I hark back to my own experience with my parents, one of the great difficulties was this balance between privacy and the feeling of responsibility. That occurred both for financial and for medical. Okay. There was a point when my parents could not actually any longer be the second set of ears in the room when they went to visit a doctor. So they would come away with a distorted view of what the doctor had said. And
Yeah.
similarly, there was a point where my mother had to take over from my father some of the financials, which she had never done.
Yeah.
And felt a responsibility to him not to blurt out to me that they needed help.
Yeah.
Okay. But she was not competent to make all the decisions, not because she wasn't a competent person, but because it was not in her experience base.
Yeah.
Okay.
That, the World War II generation had, for whatever reason, I'm probably just not knowledgeable in this, but they have a really exaggerated sense of independence and privacy. I don't think baby boomers have as much of that. Obviously some people do, but I think just the fact that Lynn McAleer posted what she did, I don't think our parents would have ever done that, but we can. We're just a different generation, and we have a different sense, a different value set around privacy and confidentiality and security. It's just something I've noticed. This is not anything that I have done research on or read research on. It's just something I've noticed. So I'm hoping. Let me tell you one quick story of my own. When my father was in his, I don't know, early 60s, and I was in my very early 30s or maybe even 20s, he sat me down and he said, look, here's where the accounts are. Here's what's in them. Here's where my will is. This is my lawyer. I want you to come with me. I want to show you the burial plot I've picked out. And here's where you'll find my will. And oh, Dad, I don't want to know about this. I don't want to think about you dying. And he insisted to a point where I finally said, okay. And I listened and I took notes, and he took me up to Pinole where the burial plot was, and he showed me where it was, and he introduced me to the people that ran the mortuary. And it was just to me, it was a horrible thing. But I'll tell you what, 15 years later, when he died, I knew exactly what to do. And that is such a gift that you can give your kids. So.
Okay, well, I think we're coming toward an end. Do we have another question, or are we wrapping up?
Solar planning agent. Fortunately, Oakmont provides neighbors and friends. Yes, they do. Yeah. I think that we're
Okay, well,
out
Dr.
of questions.
Sarah, I have to congratulate you on a great talk and a lot of things for us to think about. And I hope people will go home and think about them. That's probably the objective of her talk. Next week, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a talk on beavers. It's intended to be a celebration of Valentine's Day, beavers being animals that mate for life. So we'll see you then. Take care all.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
I just
Thank you
want
all.
to say the league read a book on beavers. It maybe doesn't sound interesting. It will be. So come.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you for coming.